So we just kickstart. Like I said, it's 5 minutes past our schedule, so we're just going to zoom in and have our conversation. I just want to use this again opportunity to welcome everyone that has joined us. I'm sure if you didn't join us for the first session, I'll take this as an opportunity to introduce today's platform to you so you can get a better understanding of what we're having here today. So we are the Africa-China Center for Policy Advisory. We've put together this program called the BRICS Dialogue. So this is an annual event that the Africa-China Center for Policy Advisory will be hosting. This is our first edition, which is virtual. We hope to progress into an in-person kind of conversation, not to rival the BRICS Summit itself, because that is at the government level. We are just as a think tank level. We're just trying to see how we can build, another level of conversation when it comes to the BRICS, especially when we are looking at Africa's core interests. So our main focus is Africa's interest vis-a-vis the BRICS alliance and the interest. So basically, that's what we are aiming to do. Briefly, the Africa-China Center for Policy Advisory, the ACCPA, is a policy research think tank, an advisory firm which is focused solely on Africa-China relations. So we are seeking to bring an African perspective when it comes to our relations with China, trade, investment, social, people-to-people exchange, and all of that. So we're trying to bring in our perspective, what we think as Africans in terms of our relation with China. So what we're trying to do is to track, analyze, research, and report on at various levels in terms of the continent's engagement with China and how we believe it can be shaped in terms of policy, in terms of public debates and conversations, and how these kind of relations can play out going forward. Because as we know, increasingly and going into the future, the relation between Africa and China is going to even get deeper, because as of now, for over a decade now, we have China as our largest trading partner, and I don't think it's slowing down anytime soon. So it's very important that we come in and share more perspective and through research and publications and debates that we've started creating across the continent. So currently we've done in-person or physical activities in both Tanzania and Ghana. We'll be progressing to other countries as well, because it's a continent-wide think tank that we are having here. And so the BRICS Dialogue is just one of many such platform that we are creating, which is not, of course, research directly. It's a platform base where we can have deeper conversations where Africa is constant in relation with other regions. For now, we are looking at BRICS. Most of the time, it's going to be about China's relation with Africa. In Ghana, we recently had forums. We had some trainings in Tanzania in recent past, and we keep going and making sure that we're able to bring more perspective with respect to our relations with China. So today's dialogue, as we call the BRICS Dialogue, it's in relation to another important global developments, which Africa really features as well. Because if you're a follower of what's happening around our world, the BRICS is gaining momentum. I will leave the details to my distinguished panelists who will get deeper into what the BRICS really are and how that plays out in Africa's interest. So that will come later on when I introduce them. But we are looking at the broader perspective, as I said, in the sense of Africa's interest in the BRICS alliance. And we believe that having such conversation will go a long way to shape policy and people's understanding about what's happening between Africa and China. So the BRICS Dialogue is going to be held annually every year. We're going to bring partners and speakers, and of course, everyone will be welcome to join in for such conversation. Now, we've done the first part, which was on infrastructure financing, finance Africa's infrastructure. Just opposing that to the BRICS alliance and how Africa can benefit from the BRICS in terms of we trying to, take care of our infrastructure financing. Now, panel 2 is about fostering inclusive trade and investment, amplifying Africa's engagement with the BRICS. So it's about inclusive trade and investment. The first part dealt with infrastructure. Now we're talking about trade and investment more specifically. So that's what the panel that we have here is going to take us through. I'll use the next few minutes to read their profile to all of you to know who we have here. So the first I have is Dr. Stacey. So Stacey is an assistant professor at Leiden University. in the Netherlands. She's an advisory panel member of the ACCPA. She's a South African national who is teaching at the Leiden University in the Netherlands, where she teaches China-Africa relations in a changing global order at the graduate level. She holds the position of Africa-Asia coordinator at the International Institute for Asian Studies. She has worked in the Africa-China space for over a decade and continues to focus her research on foreign policy, geopolitics, and African agency theory. Specifically, Links has focused on an array of areas spanning human rights, African agency, critical minerals, as well as responsible value chains in China-Africa engagement. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have Dr. Stacey Links, who has joined us for this session. And then next is my good friend, Mikatekiso Kubayi. He's a South African, he's a researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue at the University of South Africa. He's a fellow at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg, UJ, as well as a PhD candidate at UJ as well. He's an avid researcher on power and its dynamics in the international system and specializes in the global political economy of finance. His PhD research is on the role of the New Development Bank, the NDB, as a development finance institution in support of the BRICS reform and development agenda. So we have very well experienced professionals that have joined us for today's panel 2 in the person of Dr. Stacey Links and of course, Mikatekiso Kubayi, my friend there. So just to give an overview about what the topic is going to focus on. So we are focusing on trade diversification, investment promotion, and creating an enabling environment for business ventures. So we're going to look at strategies to enhance Africa's access to the BRICS market. Because when you talk about trade and investment, it's a two-way street. So we're looking at how we are going to do that, encouraging technology transfer, promoting sustainable investment flows, and also exploring mutually beneficial trade policies and investment initiatives and all of that. So ladies and gentlemen, I'll be going straight to my panelists. I'll start off first from Dr. Stacey. Stacey, if you can give us your first, perspective, in the broad sense about what we are discussing here. You can take it up to the main theme for the BRICS dialogue, which is what we are using, rethinking global development agenda, how Africa can benefit from the BRICS, and then of course narrowing down to the specific topic that we have about trade, inclusive trade and investment. And then from there, I also take the perspective of Mikatekiso before I ask specific questions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, very, very much, Paul, firstly for inviting me to speak today. And I think what's interesting about the work that the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory is kind of doing is to make this a dialogue, as you had said. I myself obviously have my experience and my research background, but I think, what's really required and also needed in this space is also to have a back and forth with fellow Africans who are in different sectors, different fields, to also give their insights and inputs onto a lot of these issues and ask questions, because, as we know, a lot of these issues, especially when it comes to issues of high economics or politics, they remain quite closed off from the general public. And so we are often caught in our kind of ivory towers where we discuss these concepts of macroeconomics and development on these international and global levels in a global scale. And that's not always obvious in terms of how that actually connects to people's everyday lives. And I think in the previous session, it was quite interesting insofar as some of the questions that came up in terms of, what does BRICS mean for me? What does BRICS mean in terms of my specific country in Tanzania? And I think, the Center for Policy and Advisory can really play that role in terms of having that dialogue. So again, I just want to say thank you. Maybe I'll just start off by saying that I am no expert in investment or trade per se. It's a topic that definitely comes into play when you do anything Africa-China related or anything related to international relations. And so there's obviously a baseline that I engage with in terms of investment and trade in my own research, but I by no means am an economist. So I speak from from my experience also as an African based in Europe, and what the conversation looks like here, which I think is also very interesting and an interesting angle through which we can try and understand BRICS in a geopolitical landscape. Now, I think when it comes to investments and trade, the previous panel on infrastructure is so indispensable as a starting block. And I say this for the very kind of logical reason that without substantive and substantial infrastructure development on the continent, investment and trade is virtually meaningless in a global sense, but also in a regional sense. And we see that investment and trade is oftentimes also hindered by a lack of infrastructure. So in terms of a chicken and an egg situation, I think it's very good, Paul, that we had the sessions for today start with the question of infrastructure. And you know, at the end of the day, investment and trade is also closely related to infrastructure. Investment happens around the sectors of infrastructure. So investments in infrastructure is a core piece of this puzzle. And if we're looking Pan-Africanly speaking, in terms of development, infrastructure will always remain a core component. And specifically, if we're looking at Africa-China relations, I think many of us here know that a huge cornerstone of Africa-China engagement remains infrastructure. Now, the key aspect is, and I think issues that we are going to touch on today, is how do we ensure that that investment is diversified? How do we ensure that Africa is not relegated to only the exportation of raw minerals, which, you know, we all know has been the kind of resource curse that the continent has been left with. I think some of these questions are, or rather, a lot of these questions, there are no easy one-size-fits-all kind of answers. And what I mean to say by this is also that there needs to be prioritization, right? As a continent, we cannot check all the boxes in one go. And so a constellation like BRICS it gives us the opportunity to engage with partners and investors that can bring different aspects of investment to the table to address African needs. So we have China that already, as we know, has invested quite heavily in infrastructure, but which is also expanding its own kind of repertoire on the African continent. We have the likes of Russia, India, Brazil, who all have their own unique kind of investment portfolios, and some of them also overlap, I think, with this question of infrastructure. But I think, you know, at the core, what is of interest in terms of BRICS and the African continent is that, as we know, South Africa is a member of BRICS, and South Africa, in that sense, even though the membership of BRICS is, you know, expanding, or there are questions of expansion, South Africa still remains a key player insofar as being a broker or a regional broker for African interests. And so I think one thing that we need to start with is to realize that as much as BRICS is constituted of member states, it also has regional importance insofar as the African continent. And so leveraging BRICS in terms of the access that BRICS gives us to various regions, global regions, is extremely important. And South Africa has a very key role to play in fostering these relations as they pertain also then to the broader African continent. But then also looking at investment areas and trade opportunities beyond just South Africa, right? So for the broader continent. And I think today is great to be able to explore what those opportunities entail, but also what the challenges are, right? When you have a constellation like BRICS, it's always going to be a game of prioritization and whose priorities come first, right? So I think it's imperative for BRICS to function as also a vehicle through which African interests can be served, that we engage with South Africa's role also within the continent, and how South Africa can play a role far beyond just itself and far beyond just, for example, even the Southern African Development Community, but really look at it from a regional, sub-regional level in terms of investment opportunities and trade. I think I'm going to stop there for now. I have a lot more that I will say along the way, but that's just my introduction for now.
Sure. Thank you very much, Stacey. I welcome Mikatekiso. So please, you have the floor. You can also give us your first perspective on the topic here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Frimpong. Firstly, for a fantastic idea. This session. It's very important to have these constant conversations, about all of these institutions, that seek, to intervene, on our behalf, as global citizens, in a variety of areas. It's for our own agency, that we must firstly know and understand what's going on, what is being said about us, and what is being proposed to be done, for us or on our behalf, and so on. So thank you so much for this effort. It's very important. Also, thank you, Dr. Links, for reminding us that this is about people, that this is about, all Africans, and all citizens of the world. It's important to remember this because BRICS did not, emerge, out of, nothing, somewhere there in some corner. It emerged because there was a problem, or there continues, in fact, to be a problem in the world, and particularly global governance. It emerged because the global financial architecture, global governance, governance of the global economy, has a problem, somewhere. There's a lot of inequity in the manner in which global governance is conducted, run. The architecture itself wasn't designed, by most people that it impacts. They've never had a say in how things ought to be shaped, designed, how things ought to work, and so on. So you have in around 2006, or so, members of cabinets of the different BRIC countries, meeting informally, of course, to discuss, how they could make a contribution in this regard. 2 years later, you have a global financial crisis. A year later, you have the launch of BRICS. Well, without South Africa at the time, of course, BRIC. South Africa then joined the following year. They exist. BRICS exist, to make an intervention, in the affirmative, in the positive, for the benefit, of principally in the global South, principally developing economies, but also for everyone. Now, I make this argument because at its very inception, BRICS made it very clear that, one, it is not a bloc that seeks to exclude or a bloc that seeks to replace, but it is a bloc that seeks, to make an intervention, to make, a contribution towards, reform for the better, for everybody to be, brought on board, in this global governance of our economy, and so on. That is where BRICS comes from. Of course, at the time, when it was launched and formed, there were many scholars, many academics, brushed it aside, dismissed it. It will never go anywhere. The countries of the G7 that control the global economy are all too powerful, and so on and so forth. Others, went as far, as accusing the effort as a Chinese publicity stunt, right? A PR, effort, by China. Others, dismissed, the inclusion or participation of South Africa in the BRICS. Small economy, does not have a chance, does not have, a voice, in the bloc, and it can't possibly contribute anything to the affairs, of the globe. Maybe it should even, understand its place, know its place, and sit somewhere there in a corner in Africa. But lo and behold, 15 years later, the BRICS bloc is talking about a payment system, that is different, or separate, from a payment system that most currently use. A BRICS bloc, is today talking about deeper integration, of economies, right? Of the developing world, economies that, for a very long time did not hardly, had, that, sufficient connectivity and integration. You have a BRICS bloc that is essentially leading conversations about a different world order, so to speak. And all of these, developments, and leadership in conversation, in dialogue, in discourse, done peacefully, without rejecting anybody, without scoffing at anybody, without attacking anybody, without blackmailing anybody, without putting pressure, on anybody to say, do this or do that, or choose this side or choose that side. No. But leading conversations, on the genuine, everyday realities and experiences, of developing economies. From the times, when, for instance, Africa was split, into so many little chunks and blocks and, so on, without its consent. When the structural adjustment policies, of Bretton Woods institutions were imposed, on many developing economies and so on. Toward now having a development bank, that seeks to, find, contribute, in a positive way, with better, access, better conditionalities, of, for access, to project finance, better terms, knowledge sharing, and so on and so forth, in that space. So that is what, BRICS is essentially about, making a contribution, in global governance, that, hopefully will lead to better outcomes, in the efforts, developmental efforts, of developing economies, particularly in the developing, in the global south. Maybe I will. That is my, first take, on it, Mr. Frimpong.
Yeah,
thank you so much once again for inviting me.
Thank you. I think the two of you have set the tone very much for my next series of questions I'm going to ask. Just you give a very historical, background. Of course, Stacey talks more about the the relevance of the first discussion that we had, which was about infrastructure, which then opened the doors for the trade and investment that we are about to discuss. Very much. So I think this has been the first very impressive comment from you guys. So my question, I'm just going to go straight into my question. So to our participants that have joined us, so you have an opportunity in two ways. The first one is that you use the Q&A button on your screen. If you are familiar with the Zoom app, you have a session marked Q&A. So you put in your question, type your question there. After my first few rounds of questions for our panelists, I will then head over to your session and read some of your questions out for any of them to answer. If you want your question to be answered by a specific panelist, you can put their name there. So this question is for Stacey, this question is for Mr. Kubayi, and then they will answer them. But you can just put your question generally, then any of them can answer. Again, you can also raise your hand, use the raise hand option, and I will give you the permission to ask your question or your comments anyway that you like. So these are the two options that you like to come, because we want you to be involved. We want this to be very conversational as much as possible. So please do ensure that you bring in your questions as the conversation progresses. So my first question to you, probably I will start, maybe Stacey will take it because I will do that in turn. My question about trade diversification. So I'm asking how the African trade portfolios can be diversified when it comes to the BRICS nations, because I think maybe even all of you mentioned about even the nature of our trade in terms of being a commodity-led trade. Is there anything else different that we have to do when we're dealing with the BRICS nation in terms of our trade policies and the portfolio in terms of what we're trading with them? So that's my question regarding the portfolio structure of how we have to deal in terms of the component itself, and of course policy related issues as well. So you can start from there.
Yeah, so maybe just to start off, I think the issue of trade and trade diversification is one that's obviously not new, and it's not new for as a kind of almost Achilles heel of the African continent, and we've been trying for decades now to diversify our portfolios also within the continent. And I think, as much as, for example, if we take China as an example, right, there's a lot of criticism against China insofar as resource for infrastructure deals, and the success of those, and the challenges of those. And I think what we need to do oftentimes is to take a couple steps back and to realize that the issue of trade diversification is really something that requires long-term planning. It requires also a collective plan, an African plan, in terms of what kind of diversification we need to see, and what are the what are the strengths of each region within the continents, and then within the BRICS member states, right, and the regions that they represent. So I think it's first important to kind of take an overarching view, and a kind of long-term view insofar as this process of trade diversification. Now, in terms of how we actually diversify trade, there is this question of adding value to our commodities, right? So there are many discussions in terms of how do we add value to our resources, our natural resources, for example, on the continent, so that we are exporting value-added products and commodities, right? And not only exporting raw materials, etc. And I think that this process is already very much underway, and we see that with the discussions, for example, in FOCAC between China and African states. Again, my focus is on China-Africa relations, but I think, the conversations beyond just the China-Africa bubble really need to happen also on a South-South level, for example, between Africa and Latin America. And I think that there's a lot that still needs to be explored in terms of this. Our focus has really been on China lately, and I think rightly so. And I think that China will, as you mentioned, Paul, at the beginning, China's here to stay, right? But now what kind of needs to happen is we need to see how our engagement with China also relates to possibilities in other regions, so in Latin America. And so knowledge sharing just on a baseline, I think, needs to also start happening much more effectively and across various sectors, to see what are areas of mutual benefits, what are areas of further trade expansion. I think, you know, if we look at South Africa and Brazil, trade has remained relatively, in terms of sectors, again, very much the same, very much stagnant. And until the continents, and when I say the continents, I mean Africa, until we get to a point of really adding value to our raw materials, right, and localizing that value-added production capacity, we're not going to be able to see that kind of trade diversification that we want to see. So on the one hand, it's about adding value to certain products. On the other hand, it's about making sure that our nascent sectors also are not completely left behind. And by this, I refer, what I have in mind, for example, is the textile industry. I think in a lot of the African continent. And there have been challenges around that, right? And there have been challenges insofar as what investment and increased economic exchange and relations with other developing countries, but also specifically China, has resulted in terms of really sidelining these other industries. I think the answers to these questions, as I've mentioned before, are not simple, because they do involve a degree of prioritization, right? It's a question of, do we want eggs all in one basket, or is diversification really, will that give us a leg up in the macro kind of goals that we have? And I think these are discussions that need to be had a lot more concretely. There are benefits to trade diversification, but in that regard, anytime you diversify, anytime you decentralize, there are consequences to that, right? You cannot put all your efforts into one sector or one industry and really hone in on that and become an expert in that industry or what have you. So I think that these are, you know, important but difficult questions that we need to start grappling with. When it comes to diversification, I know, for example, you know, in the space of green investments, right, that is really an area that the continent is focusing on, to see how can our energy needs be met, as well as trade needs be met and investment needs be met, along with climate targets, for example. So kind of seeing where and how we can couple sectors together, I think is an important starting point in this trade diversification process. As I said before, I think insofar as BRICS is concerned, starting with knowledge sharing is extremely important. And then what I mean really is not just knowledge sharing between member states, but as I say, knowledge sharing between the regions that these member states represent. Because that, I think, is where we really get the kind of value added impact of a constellation like BRICS. And that's where this diversification conversation can come in a lot more robustly. So that is what I would say insofar as trade diversification is concerned. But I think that there definitely are areas in which trade can be diversified, but it's also a question of, what does trade diversification look like, right? Are we seeking to simply add value, or are we seeking to actually broaden the bandwidth, let's say, of sectors that we trade in?
Okay, thank you very much, Stacey. So that's a good question for thought. I will welcome Mikatekiso. So please, your also perspective on the same question about trade diversification and policy regulations with respect of that.
Thank you for that. perhaps I should start by pointing out a couple of observations.
Yeah.
In my observation, the African continent has become a little more forward-looking, a little bit more assertive, about what it wants. In the following sense. The African Union published a while ago the Agenda 2063, Africa We Want. And in order to arrive at the Africa we want, the African Union has also put, for everyone there to see the 15 flagship projects, that, it feels, are important, to assist Africa arrive at this Africa we want. One of the major projects, to see fruition to date, has been the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And this free trade area, this achievement, if you like, is lauded everywhere. A game changer, bringing together a market, of over, $1.4 trillion dollar GDP, and so on. But this Africa Continental Free Trade Area, as do all the other 15 flagship projects, that includes, of course, infrastructure in ICT, health, you name it, need financing. Right? Now, you need finance for two things in this space. You need finance to build the infrastructure to support the Continental Free Trade Area, one. You also need finance to invest in production, right? Set up factories, manufacture things. You also need finance, to invest in research and development, right? Innovate solutions, bring them to market and so on, among others. And then, of course, you need investment, in education, skilling, and so on. Now, African heads of state, we've had them say this, a bit more louder, increasingly louder in recent summits, including the recent Russia-Africa summit, the Paris Paris Finance Summit a couple of months ago, and in other fora, just this year alone. You've had, different African states, going more on the front foot to say that, look, we want to move away, from a place, where raw materials are just mined out of the ground and, put on rail to ports. In fact, a lot of the port infrastructure, the rail infrastructure is actually designed to extract, to support extraction, precisely get from the mine and, take straight to the ports for, to load on ships and take, to wherever. Africa has been saying, increasingly and repeatedly that, look, we want to add value, to the goods, that we take out there, that we export. We want to manufacture, battery cells, right? We want to manufacture consumer goods. We want to manufacture computer components, and so on, right? With the materials that are extracted, from the earth. Africa has been saying, that it wants, to develop a regional value chain. By the way, as do other regions of the world. Africa has been saying this because its experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, as a recent painful reminder, is that when you do not have, the ability or the manufacturing capacity to manufacture the goods that you want, when a pandemic happens, you are essentially left out in the cold. Africa had money to procure vaccines. It could not get those vaccines because others had already ordered everything. Because you only have, just essentially just one center where you can, go and order these things. But if Africa had a better developed and evolved, pharmaceutical industry, for instance, it would manufacture its own products here and have them more readily available. Yeah? So these are the areas, of support, areas of development, that Africa has been speaking of. Now, where does BRICS fit into all of this? You will recall, that when South Africa first hosted the summit, I think that would have been in 2013 or so. South Africa invited African heads of state to the summit, as it does all the time. Africa is, a cornerstone of South Africa's foreign policy agenda. And the reason for this was that African states, need to be party to discussions, deliberations, affecting what could possibly be the future of, how the world does things, whether be it, the financial architecture, whether be it trade, whether be it, investment, and so on, right? And also to allow, African states to have bilaterals, on the sidelines of these summits, with members, with others that would be present, to see, how they can explore further progress and investments and so on, collaborations and so on. Following that, President Xi Jinping proposed, the BRICS Plus, and the BRICS outreach, programs for the same, agenda, to get more and more people, on board, in these conversations, to get more and more people to start speaking with each other and start trading with each other and expand, markets, expand, broaden, pools of finance, broaden, pools of knowledge, exchanges and so on, and increase collaborations, partnerships, and the works. Today, you have a BRICS summit that will be deliberating, about the number of countries, both on the African continent and in the Middle East and even in Europe, that have expressed an interest in joining the BRICS bloc, precisely for the same reasons, the agenda, reform, development, collaborations, all of this. Precisely for the same reasons. You have an NDB that is looking at, broadening and expanding its membership base, right? So that it can, have, access to greater pools, of funding, to be able to finance projects, pretty much everywhere, especially outside of, the BRICS membership, outside of the BRICS bloc itself. You've got all of these countries coming, all of these heads of state descending on St. in Johannesburg next week, to discuss exactly how to go about improving and deepening, integration, economic integration, trade, with each other, investment, and so on, right? With each other next week. But we also have to remember, that BRICS alone does not have all of the money, that is needed to finance infrastructure or to finance investment in manufacturing and so on, right? It's a global issue. It's a global crisis. At the Think 20, for instance, in India this year in January, commentators and academics, researchers, experts, practitioners, all agree that you need over $1 trillion per annum for the whole world, to cater for its investment in infrastructure, its investment needs in infrastructure and other areas. Africa alone needs over $300 billion per annum, right? To not only catch up, in its infrastructure backlog, but also take it to the next step, right? Now, where is this money going to come from, right? If, for instance, you look at the NDB hasn't really disbursed, much funds, much finance towards, such projects, and also it has only so far disbursed, to members of the bloc itself, members of the bank, something to the tune of under $50 billion worth. But what's important, nonetheless, is that the conversation about trade in each other's currencies, trade, with each other's currencies, local currencies, improvement, of or the development of an alternative payment system, to open things up, for countries to be able to trade with each other, as they see fit for their own interests, is a plus, is a positive move, in the right direction, so that we can have access to all of this, either knowledge, financing, investment, and so on. So yes, it bodes well, for Africa, particularly for what Africa has said and continuously says it wants, right? To diversify, its product base, to diversify and improve its manufacturing capacity, to add value to its products, to develop and innovate, solutions and bring to market, and so on. So there's a nice fit there, in that we've got a BRICS bloc that is saying, let us do these things, right? And you've got an Africa that is saying, of course we want these things, right? So there's a wide area there, potential partnership and collaboration, for the development of everybody. Imagine if, Africa could also, start to look at investing in other areas of the world as well, outside of Africa. I think that's a dream, that I, for one, have, to see Africa, investing in other areas of the world and making that kind of contribution as well. And I think that is very much possible. That is my 5 cents worth for now.
Yeah, so I'm going to do a follow-up question regarding the investment, because you made a profound point that we cannot bank our hopes in terms of the amount of investment that we need only on the BRICS, because, I mean, the gap is so huge that obviously cannot be covered only by the BRICS countries, right? So that leads to my next question, which is about, the kind of framework that as a continent we are setting up, that can actually go a long way to de-risk our environment, so that in as much as we are attracting investment from the BRICS, we can also attract investment from all parts of the world. So my question is about, what kind of framework are we looking at as a continent, in terms of building an atmosphere that can, show a level of de-riskment into our economies, and how BRICS come in, but others will also follow suit, same, and then we do more investment on the continent. So maybe Stacey, you start, or you want me to continue from Mikatekiso? Maybe Stacey.
Yeah, no, just a very short point on that. again, my points, as I've mentioned before, are very overarching points, and a lot of these questions, I don't profess to have the answers to, but it's as we said, this is a dialogue, it's a discussion. And I think one of the issues, for example, I'm a South African. I'm based here in Europe, and I often get asked about, the differences of Chinese investment culture and why the Chinese invest to the extent that they do in Africa versus Europe, right? And the reality, I think, and I think this goes for a lot of the BRICS nations then too, is that as members of the developing world or the global South, however you want to put it, we are quite used to living lives of high risk, right? So we are not as risk averse as traditional players are. And so it becomes very important, for example, if we look at the traditional OECD countries, for example, that they have a, as low a risk environment as possible. And that's always been the narrative, is lower the risk, lower the risk. The reality in Africa is that, risks, I don't think, will ever be lowered to the extent that they are often required for the security of investors, specifically from the traditional parts of the world. And you see it also coming up now more and more with the likes of China, where there are concerns about investment protections, right? Are there investments being protected when they invest on the continent? And the reality is that the risks associated with investing on the continent are crucially important to address. And a lot of them do relate to the traditional kind of issues of corruption, regulatory frameworks, legal protections, etc. I think to take a step back, though, we have to also understand that in broad strokes, investments and the protection of investments is really designed for the protection of investors, right? So for the private, so to speak. And the challenge comes in is, how do we instill investor confidence that doesn't come at the price of benefits for the host country, right? Because if we're going to take a purely profit-oriented kind of model, we very quickly run into a kind of wall. So how do we acknowledge the risks associated with doing business in the developing world or on the African continent, while at the same time acknowledging that investment cannot only be about profit making, right? And it's a very tricky kind of Bermuda Triangle to navigate, because these risks are not risks that can be erased overnight, and even regulatory frameworks to try, or legal remedies, are not always as strong as what we would like them to be. And that is just the reality. I think for me, this question of investment kind of protection goes back to a kind of long-term strategy, insofar as how are we ensuring that our future generations are clued up into these discussions in terms of national agendas, development agendas, and also Pan-African agendas for development. And what are we doing on the continent in terms of investing in our youth? Because, we time and time again speak about our youth, about our strategic kind of advantage in our youth, but we also need investments in them, right? Beyond just jobs, but actually in terms of owning the trajectory of our continent and its development. So that's just a bit of my my reflections on this issue of investment protection. I think that there's a lot of, just maybe as a final point, there's a lot of very interesting work being done by, for example, the Columbia Center on, I think it's sustainable investment practices. And, you know, a lot of interesting research being done worldwide that can really help inform our policies a lot better. And I think, you know, from the African continent perspective, I think it's important that we use these to our advantage in terms of policy making, and really engage not only what think tanks are doing, but also academics. There are many individual academics of the diaspora who have done extremely fascinating work and that can really help to tap back into our policy making at home. So I think that that's something that I would really invest in.
Thank you very much, Stacey. Mikatekiso, please, you will come in now.
Thank you, Mr. Frimpong. Frameworks. Well, earlier I said, you know, Africa is a bit more assertive, you know, on what it wants, and it has, you know, specified, you know, the various areas of needs that it wants particular attention, you know, to be paid to. 15 flagship projects. Right? That's a start. Now you've got different ways, you know, in which a lot of this requisite financing, you know, is done, whether bilateral or multilateral, and so on. And in fact, there's an increasing shift, you know, towards multilateral, you know, financing and multilateral collaboration, you know, in projects. Africa, the African Union, you know, is certainly playing, you know, a more active, you know, role, you know, in discussing the needs, you know, for the needs of Africa, the needs of the Africa free trade area, and so on. I think that's a good way to go, right? You know, to collating, you know, pulling together of resources, pulling together of you know, voices, you know, to say that, look, this is who we are, this is us, Africa, this is, you know, our package, this is what we bring, you know, on board in this potential partnership. This is what we want. This is what, you know, we expect to get in turn. These are our needs, and all of those have been, you know, specified. It makes for I believe, you know, easier, you know, and better way, you know, to go about seeking the requisite resources for the development of all of these sectors that we've been talking about. A colleague of mine, you know, and I, you know, made an argument a little while ago about, you know, particularly when Africa was going to the Russia-Africa summit, you know, arguing the need for, you know, a strong, you know, a common strategy, you know, to say that, look, you know, instead of having silos, you know, and disparate, you know, issues, but have a more concentrated, you know, effort towards achieving a particular goal. We want infrastructure in this area, and we have to go, all of us, you know, support, you know, an effort to mobilize financing for that particular area, infrastructure for rail, infrastructure for, you know. So there's a I see, you know, a positive step, you know, being taken by the African Union in this regard, Mr. Frimpong. More, of course, you know, ought to be done. We did some work at the Institute for Global Dialogue a couple of years ago, And one of the issues that we found was a bit of a challenge with the area of project management and contract negotiation, right? We would talk to at bilateral or hopefully much better at the multilateral level. We would enter into discussions, for financing, for one project or another, or an investment in one project or another, without being confident, enough, to state exactly what it is out of that project that we want, what our terms are, what our conditions are, and even, post that, the actual management, of such projects, to make sure that, the full benefits, are derived, and so on. These are some of the areas, that Africa, need to look at and improve on and develop. Invest a lot, in such. A lot of these partnerships, you are likely to see being discussed and being arrived at, for instance, next week in Sentin. Yeah, and but overall, I see a positive, Mr. Frimpong. In terms of looking at frameworks, there's an issue of standards, right? What sort of standards, whether it be in products, the manufacturing, whether be it in infrastructure, for instance, the kind of rail that you would want in Africa, whether be it rail platform that you want in Africa, whether it fits, with what is rolled out in other parts of the world, such as in China, whether they fit with each other. Whether there are a whole range, of areas, involving, common standards, that are, under discussion. I think Africa also has to, play a role in that space and speak out, on how it intends to contribute in that space. We're talking about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, for instance, the movement of peoples, right? As well as goods. So your standards also include, the kind of immigration policies that you may have, the kind of security systems that you may have, your visa regimes, and so on. So these are some very important areas that are well worth paying serious attention to.
Thank you very much. So again, we'll be welcoming questions from participants. So please, if you have questions, I encourage you to use the Q&A button, or you can raise your hand. I'll give you the opportunity to speak. After my next question, we will do that. So I'm going to ask questions, specifically this one about SME, which is small and medium sized enterprises in Africa. We all know that they form a huge, backbone of the continent's company size, the SME. So I just wanted to ask a question that ties this SME empowerment to the BRICS in terms of Africa's trade with the BRICS. So what strategies can be implemented to encourage collaboration between small and medium-sized enterprises in Africa and BRICS countries, which can promote, of course, entrepreneurship and innovation? So you may start from there, Stacey.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. I think, SME empowerment, and as you phrase it here, actually has to do with another question that we discussed previously in terms of also inclusive growth, right? It's also part of this umbrella of inclusive growth. And one of the things that in my work I'm quite passionate about, and I think I've made a reference to this, is that let's start with the African continent, but that we as a continent also start to exchange more with each other beyond the big, the big five kind of a thing. That we decentralize our engagements a lot more. That if you are, a business owner, an SME, a business owner in Mali, that you see Zimbabwe as an opportunity, that it's not always just Nigeria or South Africa or Kenya, but that we start even on a continental level to really engage, in a much more decentralized way. And that goes for enterprises too, in terms of, it's not only about the big companies, it's not only about the multinationals, but that it's really about giving the opportunity to all stakeholders to engage in these conversations, to engage in these dialogues, just as a starting point, let alone for investment opportunities, etc. I think as a baseline, we first need to firmly establish this kind of exchange within the continent a lot more effectively. And that's why, again, I come back to the fact that I think it's great that we have a dialogue like this, and I think we should have many more with people that are outside of, policy or academic circles, but where we can really get input and exchange from various communities, because it's not only for us as academics or people sitting at the table to say what is needed, but we also need to hear various voices and need to be taught about, what is needed from the ground up, so to speak. And then when it comes to the BRICS countries, I think it's very much the same kind of story, where we need to also start making it possible and start making it viable and interesting for, for people-to-people exchanges across the various BRICS countries, member states, but also the regions, right? It should be very feasible, and it should be in the minds of someone from Botswana to say, hey, there are opportunities in Brazil, and not always think about, oh, how am I going to get to Europe? And I say this sitting in Europe, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to put it, but, to kind of repivot our vision also towards the global south, to see the global south, to see the BRICS countries, member states, and their regions, their respective regions, as also valuable for us and valuable to learn from. So I would say that, and that, I'm not now directly speaking to SME empowerment, but I think it goes hand in hand with that, because at the end of the day, SMEs are, are the grassroots. SMEs are the backbone of a lot of our societies. And so I think encouraging more of that curiosity and people-to-people exchange, that's where you're going to get very innovative solutions. That's where you're going to get trade diversification and ideas coming up, especially with younger generations, in terms of collaborations, etc. So also in terms of investing, I think investing in this kind of cross-regional collaboration is extremely, extremely important. So that would be my final say on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Stacey. Mikatekiso may come in.
Mr. Frimpong, please repeat that question that you asked
about
again.
SME empowerment. So we're talking about small, medium-sized enterprises and how we are positioning them in the continent vis-a-vis our trading relation with the BRICS countries. What could be done to create that sustainable SME, kind of across member countries in Africa.
Thank you. Now, the BRICS bloc, has over 70 collaboration mechanisms. That range from finance, all the way to cultural relations, and all along, those various tracks, multiple tracks, there are conversations, about, where SMMEs, could fit in, in the exchanges and the creation of platforms for exchanges for SMMEs. So there are different areas where for SMMEs are in serious need. SMMEs also need finance. SMMEs need access to markets. SMMEs also need access to logistics support, right, to get their products to market and to various markets and so on. So a lot of the conversations that take place all the way through the various tracks along the BRICS block and the BRICS summit every year you include by the space where SMMEs could also potentially benefit. So it's not only just a focus on elite enterprise. Yes, you have a structure called the BRICS Business Council. That's very big business. That's large business, yes. But along the tracks, the various tracks, whether be it sport, culture, along the various tracks, you have conversations there, that feature very strongly on the needs of SMMEs. Now, you will also recall, so that SMMEs are very much part of the BRICS agenda. You will also recall that what happens in any bloc, right? For instance, SMMEs in South Africa, right, can access whatever it is, BRICS dividend, if you like, right, via whatever arrangements that the South African state is able to achieve with other nations in the BRICS bloc, right? So, for instance, you do not have a BRICS bloc that has, say, a power or a possibility of legislating a program that says in all of Africa this is what will happen from the BRICS bloc. Remember, the BRICS bloc also it's a bloc of countries that are very different from one another, right? Yes, all of them are literally hammering away at for a solution to deepen integration, and deepening integration and trade includes opportunities for SMMEs as well. So they're not put somewhere outside of the major discussion and negotiation framework. So SMMEs are also very much there as well. So if, for instance, one is looking at particular opportunities in one BRICS member country, for instance, take China that we've been talking quite a bit about. China does have a portal, for instance, for trade. There's an institute in Zhejiang, for instance, that promotes trade, even for small people, right? Small business to access the broader Chinese market, and it's actually live. People do access those, but that is just with China. It is not a BRICS portal. Perhaps that is something that can be proposed to the Sherpas, by way of a policy brief, for instance. That's something I think maybe colleagues could consider setting up and publishing as such. But that's a fantastic idea to consider, I think. But yes, SMMEs are, of course, very much part of the discussions. If you talk about payments, for instance, just maybe a little bit of a tangent. Payments very much includes everyone. If you talk about, if you're wanting to set up a new payment system, you're talking about types of payments, whether be it electronic payments, whether be it what is this? Digital payments, that are becoming, a major issue, of discussion. Just the ease, of payments, paying for goods. So if you want to sell something, produced in Kenya, for instance, by an SMME, and you want to export it, maybe say to India, right? The kind of payment system, that you will need to make life easier for yourself, whether be it by to shield you from high transaction charges, transaction costs, and that sort of thing. All of these discussions, affect SMMEs as well. So that again, they're not, SMMEs are not a block that sits outside of the framework of the major discussions on either payment systems or then the financing of infrastructure or the financing of manufacturing and so on. SMMEs are also very much well embedded throughout the various tracks of BRICS, over 70 cooperation mechanisms.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll be taking the next few questions from our participants, and I think we'll be concluding our session very soon. So this one is an anonymous question, is asking about what are your thoughts on the West trying to imply that African nations are entering into bad deals with China, or that China is a West ally to have than the West. So this is very China-specific question regarding our relation with China, whether what the West is saying about China, whether it's true that we shouldn't deal with China because they are better than dealing with China. So what is your take briefly about this? Maybe I start making Mikatekiso and then I'll come to Stacey.
Is it for me?
Yes, I mean, you start from, then I'll go back to Stacey.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, it's very interesting. I mean, these narratives have been ongoing for some time. I think colleagues should recall that China hasn't been a topic of conversation in this space for a very long time. You can talk about Chinese investments and Chinese loans, maybe say over the last 20 years, but look at what happened, prior to that. I mean, if I'm not too sure that China is Africa's biggest creditor rather. I think if you look at some of the numbers out there, you might find that Africa is still more heavily indebted to other parts of the world than it is, to China, and so on. And you will also notice that Chinese loans or even Chinese aid, has also started to, look more at focused, projects, as in more project-driven, as opposed to, okay, here's a bundle of cash, see what you do with it, a type thing. I'm not too sure, about Western countries wanting to divide Africa, and so on. I wouldn't want to speak, for Western countries. I think they can speak for themselves, in that regard. But I think it is well worth, remembering the history, of African relations, with the West. In as much as we talk about Africa's relations with the BRICS bloc, we also have to constantly, remember, Africa's relationship, with the rest of the world, with others, broadly, where we come from, what happened, and what benefits or other, that Africa, got out of those out of those relations. We have to be, honest and pragmatic, about these issues. All of these relations have a history, and some of it painful, others not, or others less so. But we have to bear some of those things in mind as well. Thank you.
Yeah, Stacey, your take on this?
Yeah, maybe just on that point. considering that I am based in the West. You know, it's very interesting because it definitely is a narrative that holds quite a bit of weight and sway here. And you have to see it, or rather you cannot see it in a political vacuum and a geopolitical vacuum, right? For the West, for Europe, for the United States, China is competition, and China's competition on an economic level, on a political level, on a hearts and minds level when it comes to Africa. And that's very much present in the political discourse here. And so, you know, the reality is that they grab onto what they can grab onto to maybe taint or frame the relationship in a certain way, with their own interests in mind. Now, that's not to say that that China-Africa relations are always perfect. It's not to say that they're inherently bad or any of these extremes, should I say. But the complexities are often lost in the broader political agendas and political narratives. So I think, you know, to answer that question, that is often the case that China is presented in that way, particularly in the West, but that it serves a very political agenda too is something that we have to bear in mind.
Right, thank you very much. So I'll be asking the next question, and then thereafter, I think we'll be wrapping up. So this one is from Samuel. So he's saying that, okay, thank you for engaging discussions and valuable insight from the panelists. So then my concern is centered around the timeline for implementing practical policies that truly benefits Africa. So around 2 decades ago, I studied the African Trade Agreement in high school and was truly impressed by its framework. Regrettably, we are yet to see tangible results from it in practical terms. So I guess we just want some few comments about, you know, a timeline for implementing practical policies that will truly benefit Africa. So we are having this conversation about the BRICS, Africa's relation to the BRICS for trade and investment, inclusivity, and SME empowerment and all of that. So I guess he wants to know what could be more practical in terms of policy that from the African perspective that can easily be implemented whilst we're dealing with the BRICS alliance. Yeah. So any of you can take it. Whoever is ready to.
Links?
Yeah, maybe just quickly to say that, you know, I think when it comes to, I think there have been a lot of strides made in terms of the African free trade agreement. And, you know, what I notice is that those of us in these spaces are very much attuned to the happenings and attuned to the milestones and the progress of these agreements. And it's not always obvious for others outside of these circles. And I think in terms of when we can expect tangible results, I think, you know, when it comes to free trade on the continent, it's still going to take a very, very long time. There are still many, many steps that need to kind of be put in place. But the fact that the African free trade, continental free trade agreement has been signed and that it is technically in effect is a huge milestone, because we have to also remember that we are continents of 54 states, right? So to even get to that kind of agreement is a milestone in and of itself. And I think one of the things that we need to remember is to kind of manage expectations of what such an agreement looks like, and what is the tangible experience for people on the continent. And that's going to look very different depending on where you find yourself, what sector you find yourself in. I know that the free trade agreement has different phases, right? And that phase one is only starting now. So there's still a very long path to go in terms of the African Free Trade Agreement. But the fact that it has now become a kind of concrete reality in global discourses too, I think is very pivotal. And I think that we'll see a kind of snowball effect in years to come, insofar as tangible outcomes and outputs of a free trade agreement as we see.
Thank you very much, Stacey. So instead of so I was just going to ask this last question so you can tie in with your comments. The person is asking, Stephen is asking, what will BRICS do differently from what the USA and others are doing in terms of aid to Africa, and also in matters of conflict in the sub-region? So this is what the question is. So what do we think is different about the BRICS that different from what the US or other parties have been playing on the continent in terms of trade or aid and investment, and of course in terms of the conflicts that are happening? So Mikatekiso, you can start from there.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Frimpong. Just to state also on the other question, remember, Africa also needs the same money that the rest of the world needs for its infrastructure, projects, investments, and so on. So money is also needed in Asia, money is needed in South America, and so on, in Eurasia, for the same. So it takes a while. I mean, the debate currently, there are summits, just about how to finance investment, how to finance infrastructure, and all of those things happening across the globe, every day. So it may take a while, to get for some of the projects, to be realized, because they need money. And right now there's a bit of a shortage of such money. But what does BRICS do differently? Well, it already does do things. It's very different already. I mean, you've got an NDB that will give you about maximum 3 months, for instance, from when turnaround time, from the application for financing of a project and actual approval and disbursement, right? That is very different, to what you'd get maybe, say, from other many multilateral lending institutions already. The BRICS bloc itself takes decisions on consensus. It can be a bit arduous, but nonetheless, it takes decisions on consensus. So everyone is, all the states, all the parties are free that whatever decision is taken, they have been on board and they can, actually own, that space. Also, just the agenda alone, of BRICS, reform and development, right? Just that alone is different, because it's actually saying you have to reform the architecture, that will make it more possible, easier, and better to represent those voices that are currently nowhere, to even be seen, but also for them to access financing easier, for them to pay less costs, on transactions, and so on and so forth, to open up trade, so that they can access more markets, they can, and so on. So already, from what BRICS has said, set out to do, it is already achieving quite a lot in that regard. What it set out to achieve in 2009, it has already moved serious strides towards that direction. But yes, there's a lot. It's all of it out there for everyone to see.
Thank you. Stacey, I will take your comment on this and your last, round up your last comments about the discussion.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I think Mikatekiso said everything in terms of that BRICS is, it's fundamentally different. Its raison d'être is fundamentally different to traditional players, or to the West or to the US. BRICS is not about conditionalities. It's not I think in the question there was something about aid. This is not a charity grouping in that sense. So its fundamental rationale is different, and in that sense, at least in principle, everyone comes together on equal footing, irrespective, right, of economy size, of history, of regime type, whatever have you. So it's fundamentally different on that level. And in that sense, I think maybe just to round off is to note that these, I've also heard, I remember last year it was, I was at a meeting with various German politicians at the time, and someone in the audience had asked a question about BRICS and said, "Oh, but BRICS is not relevant anymore," which is very interesting to hear that kind of comment as an African based here in Europe, because I think BRICS is very alive and very well, as all of us here sitting and discussing this know. But I think the key thing, irrespective of what the view on BRICS is, globally speaking, the key thing for us on the continent is to have these discussions about what BRICS can mean and do for us on a continental level and for our continental goals. And maybe to circle back to some of the initial points I raised is, I think it's extremely important that we have these dialogues and that we have these engagements much more frequently with people from various sectors across the continent, because I think there's something very worthwhile about having these discussions in a very open and frank way, and where people can ask any line of questions, as technical or non-technical as they may be, because at the end of the day, these kind of forums and these groupings do affect our lives, whether we see those connections immediately or not. They do have an impact on our lives, and to kind of bring that into discussion, I think, is very important. So I just once again want to say thank you very much for having me here, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And please, to any of the participants, if you have follow-ups, please feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn or by email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stacey. I'll take your last comment, my friend, Mr. Kubayi. There's your last comments, then I'll wrap up.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Once again, thank you to the Africa China Center for Policy and Advisory for having this session. In fact, I would encourage it to grow from strength to strength. It's very important to have these regular conversations about BRICS, because it purports to be intervening on all of our behalf. So it's important to understand where exactly it is intervening, how it is trying to do so, and so on. It's very important to know what we're getting ourselves into as African citizens, as a global citizens, and so on. I am confident that a lot is going to be said at the conclusion of the summit next week. You're talking about something that hasn't been seen since I don't know how long. Imagine not too long ago you had an Iran and a Saudi Arabia not seeing eye to eye, right? Today you have both of them having applied to join BRICS, together with 21 other states have actually applied to join the BRICS bloc. You may well hear that some have been that some applications have been accepted. I don't know, but the fact that there's such a conversation happening right now, essentially implying an expansion of the size of the BRICS market, right? Alone, the size of the BRICS population, the size of the resource pool within the BRICS bloc, and so on and so forth. It's a huge significant development, and all of it comes to a head next week. Of course, every single year there are multiple discussions, over 170 meetings, BRICS meetings, various tracks every single year. So it's also important to be aware of all of the various meetings that take place throughout the course of the year. Next year, Brazil, no, it's not Brazil that hosts it next year. Who is it? Russia, hosts it next year. And in that in that year, you will have similar meetings taking place from January all the way up to even beyond the summit itself. So we have to pay attention to all the developments throughout all of these discussion tracks as well. Once again, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you very much, Mikatekiso, Kubayi, and Dr. Stacey Lanes for joining us for the first edition of the BRICS Dialogue, hosted by the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. We thank you very much for sharing your valuable time and insight with us. So this was recorded, so we're going to put it together nicely and have it on our channel. We'll share it with you and share with our contact. Those just join us, if you have further questions, you can always reach us on our website. Just Google Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. To land you on our website, you can find us on all the social media platforms, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. We are all available. You can send in your questions. Our speakers' names are on the screen, so you can connect with them via LinkedIn and chat with them directly if you have any follow-up questions. We believe that it's been a very insightful session for us, from the first panel to the second panel, and hope to progress the conversation. We'll have another BRICS Dialogue next year and the year after, and hope to have all of you join us in those conversations. For ACCPA, we'll continue having some of these conversations in the coming weeks and months. So obviously we'll reach out via email with those updates. So until then, we'll say a big thank you to all of you for joining us for our first edition of the BRICS Dialogue. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Bye.